Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to Oasis Digital's Angular Lunch. It might get rebranded to an advanced Angular Lunch, by the way, so anyone who's going to be scared off by structural directives, this is what it's going to be like. I mention that because there is also an Angular evening event, which Paul Spears, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but he works at Oasis Digital, and he has adopted the evening Angular event in St. Louis, and we have little stickers up here. So if you don't know about that Angular evening meetup, grab one of these little, not stickers, grab one of these little pieces of paper up here and get signed up for that so you get notified. We're working on some sort of special re-kickoff event of some kind to reinvigorate the evening group. So for today, we have John Baur. He's talking about structural directives, which are definitely an advanced Angular topic. But a very important topic when you're building like seriously reusable code, kind of, enterprisey important things. So John, take it away.
All right, thank you. I'm John Baur, and like Kyle said, I'm going to talk through creating structural directives today. If you're not familiar with structural directives, well, it probably just means that you're not familiar with the naming. Structural directives are the directives you see that have the asterisk in front of them, things like ngIf and ng4. These are directives that are responsible for directly manipulating the DOM. So today I'm going to start by walking through kind of how ngIf and ng4 work, and then we'll start adding our own functionality to these structural directives. I'm not big on slides, so we're going to jump right into code. Sorry. So here I've just set up a very basic simple app with an ngIf here that's going to toggle a title when I click this button. And in the template, probably something you've seen before. So I've just got a button with a click event that's toggling a flag, and an h1 down below with an ngIf directive binding the value of that flag. So I want to start by really looking into what's going on behind the scenes here and how Angular makes this ngIf directive work. So if I uncomment this piece of code, this is what Angular is doing behind the scenes. The asterisk is just a sugared syntax for the ng template that Angular creates. And so what Angular is doing with this directive is it's actually going to unwrap it and put an ng template element around the content. It's going to move the value of the ngIf, make that a property binding of the ng template. And everything else that was in the content is going to be moved inside that ng template. Now, an ng template is just a template that Angular allows you to use inside your directive. It doesn't do anything on its own. To give you a small example of that, I created another one, just a small ng template with no directives on it that says this does nothing. If I go back, you see that my structural directives, sugared and desugared, are working the exact same way, but the other one doesn't do anything. It doesn't even show up on the screen. That's because we've created a template, but we haven't told Angular what to do with it. So in order to actually understand how Angular puts this template into the DOM, I'm going to create my own directive. I'm actually going to call it a JBIf, and I've created the base for that directive already. So I've got my new directive. Now notice there's nothing in here, nothing in the decorator saying that this is a structural directive. That comes later when we do our dependency injection in the constructor. So I'm just saying that the selector for this directive is a JBIf. And inside my constructor, I have two pieces of dependency injection. The first is a template ref. This represents an embedded template that can be used to instantiate the embedded views. More specifically, this represents an instance of the template inside this ng template. So this is the content of your element that you want to inject. Second, I'm going to inject a view container ref. Now this is, Angular describes it as a container where one or more views can be attached to a component. This is the tool that Angular gives us to actually attach that template into the view. And so if I really wanted to do just the most basic, well, let me go back and let me put a third heading on here. We'll call this my JBIf directive. And we'll go ahead and put a star JBF on it. So right now that's not going to show up because I haven't actually injected that template. But if I wanted to do just the most basic structural directive, in here I would reference that view container ref, and I would call its create embedded view method and pass it the template that I want to embed in the view. And so that is just going to be the template ref. So I'm taking the contents and just embedding it into the view on the screen. And now my template is showing up in the view. So that gets us our content on the page, but it doesn't give us any of the functionality yet. So the next thing I want to do is actually pass in that Boolean flag to say whether or not I want to create it. So I'm going to create an input here called JBIF. So it's going to have the same name as the selector, and that's a Boolean. And instead of doing this in the constructor, I'm going to do this in the onChanges event. Now this could also be done in the setter for the input. I've just chosen to do it in the onChanges for this example. And so anytime the value of this JBIF input changes, it's going to execute this onChanges event. So the first thing I want to do is I want to clear the view, because I don't know whether this content should be shown or not yet. So let's clear it out, and then we'll decide whether to inject it or not. And now we just use a simple if statement. So if that input is true, then I'm going to create the embedded view with the template ref. So back in my template, if I now bind the show title here, now my directive, when it's false, it's going to clear the view and not put anything else in. If it's true, it's going to clear the view, but then it's going to add my template. And it's the same, it's destructuring it the same way. So it really looks like this after Angular gets a hold of it. Oh. So the JBIF becomes my input, which I have just a normal component input here. And then in the onChanges, just some basic JavaScript logic to decide whether or not that template needs to be injected. So that's the basics for creating the simplest version of an ngIf. The next thing I want to show is how I would duplicate an ngFor, or how I would recreate the ngFor. So let me comment out all this code and just show my ngFor. Oops. So I've created this service that loads a list of employees, and I'm looping over the list of them and just showing their first name. And I really wanted to go over the ng template syntax on the ngIf, because that's a really simple version of it. The ngFor gets a little more complex. There are more pieces to untangle. And what we see here is that the value passed to the ngFor is not a simple Angular expression. This is actually a microsyntax that will be parsed by Angular. And so Angular will parse this string, and when it sees the word let, it's going to transform that into this let imp. What's happening here is, unlike on the ngIf, we have some context. We have some data that needs to go along with each one of these elements. And Angular is going to take that context and assign it to a template input variable called emp, so that we can then bind emp inside our template. The second PCC is this ngFor of employees. This one, you may have seen this in error messages if you were one of the early adopters of Angular and moved from AngularJS to Angular. In AngularJS, their repeater directive used the word in instead of. And if you tried to use an in, you got an error message that said something about it couldn't find ngFor in. I saw that for a long time, and I didn't really think much about it. It just triggered me to, oh, I need to put in of. But what's really happening is that the microsyntax parser is taking this word of, title casing it, and prefixing it with the name of the directive, and adding a new property binding with that name. So just by putting in the word of, it's making a property binding to ng4 of, and then binding the value of employees into that property. So now I'm going to go through recreating this to show you how all of these pieces work individually. So my JB4 directive, I already set up kind of the base template the same way. I've injected my template ref and my view container ref. This time my input, notice we don't have an ng4 input. ng4 is still marking that this is the directive, but my input is going to be the ng4 of. So I'm going to make a new input called JB4 of. And this is going to be an array of something. I don't know what the user is going to bind in. I just know it's going to be an array. So now in my template, or I'm sorry, in my ng on changes, I'm going to start by clearing the view again. And now I need to loop through this array, and for each item in the array, I'll create a new element. And so the first thing I'll do is I'm going to check to do a little simple check to make sure it looks like an array. So if this thing is an array, then I'm going to do a for each on it. So for each item in this array, oops, and here's where we create the embedded view again. Oops. So that creates the view. Now I get that template, but for the ng4, I actually need the reference to the thing that I'm iterating over. In this case, it's our list of employees. So in each one of these, I need to provide my template with a reference to that employee object. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new object. Sorry. I'm going to create a new context object, and I'm going to give it a property of implicit. And the value of that implicit will be the item that I'm iterating over. And then the second parameter of this create embedded view is the context object that is provided to the template. Now the reason I created this object, or the reason I created an implicit $implicit property on the object is because of how we're using letImp here. So let me go ahead and copy this and make my JB4. We'll get rid of the other stuff. So letImp is a shorthand of saying letImp equal $implicit. What this is doing is saying take the $implicit property off of that context object and assign it to the EMP template template input variable. So using my JB4, we've now recreated that functionality. For each item in the array, I've created that context object, assigned the $implicit property to be the employee we're iterating over. And now I can use the shorthand to just say take the implicit property and assign it to EMP. But that's not all we can do with it. We can, that's just one piece of data I can pass into it. As we know, ng4 has several different things you can, several different pieces of data you can reference. You've got the index, the even or odd, first and last. So if I wanted to put one of those into place, I could just add another property to this. So let's say I wanted to get the index. I'll change this for each function to grab the index property is to grab the index off the array as well. And I can add that index to the context object. So now my JB4 can add a semicolon here. There's a couple ways you can do this. You can do the let I equal index. Let me break this up into a couple lines. So I can do let I equal index and just bind to I. Or I can use the more recent syntax, index as I. Either way, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to take that index property, assign it to a template variable I, and now I have a binding to the template variable inside, or now I have a binding to the index inside my template. Okay, so that's all good. Now we've recreated some of the functionality of the ngIf and ngFor, but I really haven't shown you a reason to create a structural directive. All we're doing is recreating things that are already there. So what if I wanted to add a little bit more functionality into here? And one thing I've always wanted to do, or one thing that I miss from AngularJS, there aren't many, but one of the things that I miss from AngularJS is the ability to put an ngFor and an ngIf on this, put a repeater and a conditional on the same element. With structural directives, the way they're written, you can only have one structural directive per host element. And the reason is that structural directives can do a lot of different things with that host element. And if they start conflicting with each other, how do you know which one gets preference? So Angular has created a way around that by giving us the ng container so we can nest one inside the other. But sometimes I still feel that clutters up my template a little too much, or clutters up my HTML a little too much. So I'm going to add another property here that lets me add an if to this for. So what I want to do on the for is I'm going to add one more input. I'm going to call it a JB4 if. And what I'm going to pass here is a function that's going to be run on each one of these elements in the array. So this is going to be a function that takes anything and it returns a Boolean. And what I really want to do here is before I start looping over the array, I want to run this function. Well, let's write the function first. Let's write the function first so it makes a little more sense what we're going for. So here in my employee list component, I'm going to make a new function. Let's say we only want to show the employees who have really long names. And so I'll create a function called hasLongName, which is going to take an employee. I'm sorry, let's make this an arrow function. And it's going to return true if emp.lastname.length is greater than 6. So this is the function we'll use inside our for to determine whether or not we need to display the item. So what I want to do in my for, so in my ng-on-changes, and this is part of the reason I put it in the ng-on-changes instead of on a setter, is because I actually want to run this anytime the JB4 of changes, anytime the array changes, or if I pass in a new function. And so to catch all of that, I went ahead and just put an on-changes event here. So if this is an array, the first thing I want to do is filter the array. And I want to filter it by saying take the item and return true, take the item, only return the items for which that if function returns true. I'm actually going to put another guard in here. If somebody doesn't pass in that if function, then I want to go ahead and pass it. So if the if function doesn't exist, or if the if function does exist and it returns true for that item. Return that array, and then loop over that array and return the items here. And so now back here in my template, I just need to use that new input. So the same way we used JB4 of by using of and giving it the name of the thing we want to binding in, this is the JB4 if. So I'm just going to say if has long name. So let imp of employees if has long name. Let's go ahead and show the last name here so we can be sure that's working. And so now we get the list, but it's filtered down to only the people who have last names longer than 6 characters. And I'll let you count them all out if you want to, but it's working. All right, so that was kind of my basic intro to structural directives. But again, this is still, yeah, it's kind of neat that I was able to do a little bit more with the repeater. But there are so many more powerful things that structural directives are useful for. Anytime that you want to do any sort of manipulation with the DOM, you can use the structural directive for that. So I've come up with a more advanced example. This is one that I actually had a motivation to use in a real project. I had a project where I had buttons or links or something that I needed to click on, and I needed that to open up a dialog that would let you choose a file and then do something to process that file. Well, the way I know how to do that in HTML is you need an input somewhere on the screen with a type equals file. But I don't always want that input. Sometimes I want a button. There's still ways with Angular to put that button on the screen and use Angular to trigger a button click. But really, I just wanted a directive that I could slap on anything. It would put that input in the DOM and do the right thing. And so let me go back. Sorry. Yeah. So back here in my app component, I'm going to, just for a second, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong keystrokes here. There we go. I've put in this new button called JB File Chooser, and it says Choose File. And when I click on it, a file selector pops up. I can select a file, and it does something with it. Now this uses some more complex concepts. The first thing it does is I need to put this input on the screen, but it's not just a simple input. I need to add some attributes to it, add some inputs and outputs. I actually needed a component to represent this input. And so I did that by creating first a file chooser component. And the file chooser component looks like this. Let me break it up on a few lines. So it's an input with type file. I've given it this tag so I can reference it inside my template, inside my component. Sorry. These are just standard attributes. It's hidden. I want to allow you to choose multiple files. And on a change event, which is the event that fires once you select your files, I want to emit a process files event from the component. So the component itself is actually pretty simple. Here's all the code for the component. So it has a view child to grab a reference to the input. It has a method on it called choose_file. When you call that method, it's going to click the input. So you have a file chooser component. You can call a method to click the input, and after somebody selects files, it emits process files. That's all there is to it. Now back in my directive, it gets a little bit more complex. So here I've injected a couple more things, and I'll talk about them as I use them in the constructor. But the first thing I do is I've named my view container ref VCR, and I create embedded view passing in the template. That's the first thing I do. So there's no conditional logic, there's no looping. I just want to take the thing that I put the template on and put it back into the view. This root node 0 is how I get a reference to that element. So after I put it in the view, I want to grab a reference to the element because I need to do something else with it. And what I'm doing is I'm injecting the renderer here. This is the Angular service that lets us intercept rendering calls because I want to register a click event on this element. So if I click back to my, where's my employee list component? Oops, it's actually on my app component, sorry. What I want to do is I want to register a click event to this button that does the right thing with my directive. And so I use this renderer.listen to say listen for click events and register this method to it. So this is my choose file method defined below. And I'll talk about how that works in a few minutes. The next thing I want to do is, in addition to putting this button back in the DOM, I need to put this component that I've created, my file chooser component, into the DOM. And so the way you create a new component is first you have to create a component factory. And that's by injecting this component factory resolver. So we're going to call its resolve component factory method to create, to get a factory to create this component. Then we're going to use that view container ref again, but this time we're going to call the create component method and pass it that factory. And now the view container ref is going to create an instance of that component and inject it into the DOM. And then I'm going to grab a reference to that component as well, because I need to interact with the component from my directive. So I'm going to skip down a little bit and show what I'm doing inside this choose file. So if you remember, anytime I click on the button now, I want to call my choose file. What that's going to do is it's going to grab the instance of my component that's been injected and call the choose file method on the component. So this is just a way of passing the click event from the element consuming the directive all the way down to the component inside. So once I choose this, it's going to call choose file on the component, which is going to click that button and open up the dialog. After we choose files, we're then emitting from the component that process files event. Well, an event emitter on a component is really just a fancy subject. I mean, there's more to it than that, but it extends a subject. And so that's what I'm doing here, is I'm consuming that process files event as a subject. And I've got a pipe on here to make sure I unsubscribe correctly, but I'm subscribing to changes of that event to say anytime a new file list comes through, I want to process those files. And here's where things get a little bit more complex. What I would love to do here is I would love to have an output on my directive that I can then bind to and then process it from the consumer of the directive. Unfortunately, there's a bug in Angular right now where you are not allowed to use outputs on the sugared syntax of directives. So if I were to manually put an ng template around this, I could bind data in and I could catch events coming out. But there's no way to use this star syntax and catch events with an output. So we had to get creative and find a workaround for that. So I just talked about that event emitters are just kind of a fancy way of dealing with subjects. Well, why not just pass a subject as an input to this directive? And that's what I did here. So my input, choose file, is a subject. And whenever my inner component passes up a new file, I'm going to make sure that this file chooser subject exists, and I'm just going to push those files into the subject. Whoops. Then for my app component, I kind of do the same thing I would have done. If I would have been subscribing to or listening for an event, I still would have had to do something to react to changes to that event. And so here in my TypeScript, I'm just subscribing to changes to this choose file. And right now I'm just taking those files and spitting them out to the log, but we could do something else like upload them to a server, do some other sort of processing. But now we can see that if I make the log bigger, once I choose a file, click open, it's going to take it all the way back out, and I can process it from my app component. So logging the files. Yes? Can I show the DOM was the question. Yes. Let's see if I can. So can you see the DOM okay? Like that. So what do we have here? I just lost my train of thought, what I'm looking for.
Does your code put the input in when you click it, or is it like there in advance?
Say that again?
Does the code, I'm trying to remember exactly what your code did. Does it put that input in?
Yeah, so the code,
The button, or is it
the code,
already be there? Oh, there's it right there.
yeah, okay. So yeah, the code is putting this app file chooser, which has the input. My directive is putting this file chooser into the DOM. And when I click on something, it's passing that click down to the input. So I have all of these examples up on my GitHub if you go to John R. Baur. But that was those are my examples, and now I'll take any questions.
Well, I'll start with a question. When you first showed your JB if, you said, and you showed the selector, you said there wasn't a star there. And you said it's defined later that we need the star. Maybe I just looked away, but where is the spot that actually makes that hook? Like, what do you need to do for a directive so that it needs the star?
Yes, thank you. It's a good question. So it's actually the act of injecting template ref into your constructor is what makes you need the star, because the star is actually what tells Angular to wrap the content in that ng template, and the template ref injection is what gets the content passed into the component.
I have many questions, but I don't want to use up all the questions. If there's a question
We got one over here.
So where does where does that special directive actually get registered? Does it get registered the same as a component, or is there a different syntax
Yeah,
for
I
that?
didn't show that at all. So the directives get registered in your list of declarations. So
Okay,
just
so
like
it's-
your components are registered in your app module or in whatever module you're registering. The other thing I didn't, this is a good segue, I didn't talk about the entry components. So the file chooser component, the one that my directive is creating, needs to be added in your entry components in your module. That is a list of any components that aren't going to be created directly by Angular. Because I'm manually triggering the creation of that component, I need to put in this list of entry components, and that makes it available at a different place in the life cycle.
I have questions. My first question isn't a question. It's like, thank you, that was awesome. It's not really a question.
Thanks.
So applause. My question is, like, how do you know when you need to do this kind of deep Angular magic versus just making a component? Like, what kind of situations do you think, like, I need like a better, like an NGF-like thing that's better, or like a 4 that has extra magic?
Right. Yeah, that's a question that I've asked myself many times. a lot of it was trying to come up with motivation to create a structural. I wanted to try to create a structural directive, and sometimes you force yourself to create it. I actually created a couple different ones before I realized they weren't needed. But anytime you want to do some sort of DOM manipulation, if you want to put new elements into the DOM or remove something, that's kind of the best answer I have for that. In the case of my file chooser, the only way to make this work was to add another element to the DOM, and I was tired of even after I had the component, I was tired of manually adding the component everywhere. So I used the structural directive to reach into the DOM and just put the element in for me.
As a follow-up to that question, would you see a case being if you needed to create like some kind of dynamic survey engine that used JSON data to determine what the questions would be? Is that like a case you would use structural directive?
Let me think about that. So if you've got, you're dynamically based on data determining what sort of components to put into the view. I could easily see, I mean, I'm hesitant to say yes, structural directives are the answer for that because there may be other answers to that problem, but I could see that you have the star whatever and pass it some data, and then inside the logic, inside the constructor, on changes of your directive, you would say, based on the data, or clear out the view, and then based on the data, inject this component into the view. I could see that being a good use for structural directives.
Are there any performance implications versus just dumping that same component kind of everywhere?
I haven't noticed any performance implications. Because the alternative to the structural directive is, I think you're saying, just a bunch of ngIfs or an ng switch saying, based on the data, display these things. I haven't noticed any performance hits. The one that actually came to my mind was, and I thought this question might come up, if we go into my JB if directive, the thing that I kind of wondered about is we're clearing out the container every time that input changes, and it seems like there might be some sort of performance hit. It was kind of funny. I was looking into, I hate to bash any documentation because we're live, but in the documentation for structural directives, they recommend something like this. So they recommend something like that. If it's true, then create the embedded view, else clear it out. And that works great if all you're passing in is a Boolean and switching it between true and false, but I tried it by passing in truthy values that change over time. And what happens is it keeps creating a new embedded view without ever clearing it. So I thought, I don't really know any other way to do it other than clearing. And so I looked into the source code for ngIf to see how they do it. And I found that they're very eager about clearing out the view. And so I take that as a hint that it's not really a performance problem. Kyle looks like he has something to say.
Formulating a question, we asked a question. So it feels like I've written a lot of Angular code, but like you, I've only had to dig into this stuff maybe like 3% of the time. Like I had to make, early on I made something that was like halfway between an if and a for. And this was like very early, and I did it by grabbing the source code to both of those and kind of hammering them together until it executed. But I happen to know, John, that you have experience making your own grid. Did this stuff come up in making your own reusable grid? Is that like a scenario?
For me, it was one of the scenarios that I started down the path thinking I needed it and then threw it away. I was trying to, this was before Angular had anything with virtual scrolling, and I was trying to implement that. I had a grid with a lot of data in it, and I didn't want to render everything. I just wanted to render what was in the viewport. And so I created I copied from some other code that I had found on the web, but I did some calculations based on the size of the viewport, tell it how many of these to put in, tell it how many rows to put in the grid. I did the same thing with columns. And then it's one of those that grew, that evolved until I realized that I could strip out the logic and just put an ng repeat in there. So yes, it was my first, it was my first deep dive into structural directives, but I ended up not needing it.
Anybody in the room has used structural directives? Now would be a good time to ask any questions. Okay, that's fine.
I had another example. If, in my project, we have complicated logic for each item on the screen to say if the user has permissions to view this particular button or whatnot. And so I wrote a structural directive called allow, and it was basically ngIf, and I did copy and paste ngIf to start with. And now instead of having ngIf equals and some complicated logic, the developers throughout the application can just say star allow equals, and they give an ID for that button or whatever, and then the logic for figuring out whether or not that button is allowed to be shown is then encapsulated in this reusable structural directive. So it's like an ngIf, but I moved more of the business logic into it so that I didn't have to worry about developers remembering exactly what to do on every single screen. They just say allow equals, submit button, and it's all good.
Yeah, one more thing that I meant to point out, if I go back to my, all right, I already cleared that out. Let me, one of the important parts of this, one of the important parts of understanding the destructuring here is I made this ng4 of a property of my ng4 directive, but Angular actually does just make this a property binding to ng template. And as I was looking into more of the source code, ng4 of is actually a separate directive. So I didn't make it as a separate directive, but you could make ng4 as a separate directive. And because of the way ng template is parsed, because of the way the microsyntax parser is taking this apart and making it a property binding, there are different solutions.
I have a small question.
I haven't used the syntax of let-emp before. Isn't that just another form of hashtag DMP?
I know the old syntax. Wait, you haven't? Oh, you mean in the destructured, like that?
Yeah.
That's one way to find out. Oh, I believe the answer is no. And I'm getting an error in my editor. So that may have been an old use of it, because I know that, back in the early alpha days, I don't know how long it went, but that was the syntax. So I don't know if they changed both at the same time, or I don't remember. Sorry. All right, if there's nothing else, I think it's a good time to wrap it up. We'll go